Good evening. Good to see everybody tonight. Logan, nice to see you. Barry's on vacation, and when he asked me if I would fill in for him, I said, I guess so. So, I am. I'm not replacing him. But tonight, I want to spend a little bit of time with you looking at a passage from the book of Ruth and thinking about some lessons we can learn from that. It'll be Ruth chapter 1. And we're all pretty familiar, I think, with Ruth. If you remember, if you're thinking about your Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. And in the time of the Judges, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. So they left their home because there was a famine. He and his wife and his 2 sons, and his name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. The sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went to the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took Moabite wives. One was named Orpah, the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and Mahlon and Chilion died, so the woman was left with her 2 sons, without her 2 sons and her husband. This is where I want to start really paying attention to this scene. And then she, that is Naomi, arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she'd heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she heard it was a good time to go home because the famine had been over. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you've dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi says, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my wombs that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I'm too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they're grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it's exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. What did Orpah do? It says she kissed her mother-in-law, but it's unwritten, but we understand what she did when she did that. She was kissing her bye, wasn't she? She was telling her, I'm going home. I'm going home. But Ruth clung to her. And Naomi said, "See, your sister-in-law's gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." And you know, so many times in weddings, I've heard this verse read. But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said, "No more." So the 2 of them went on their way. And they went to Bethlehem. And when they got to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. You know how everybody is when when you see somebody you haven't seen in a long time. We had homecoming just a week and a half or so ago. Had a few folks that we hadn't seen in a while. It's kind of nice when we see those people, isn't it? Every now and then we've had visitors that were here in years past, and you could tell from the noise in the foyer that somebody was here that kind of got the whole place stirring a little bit. Well, the town is stirred up because they've come back. The women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord's brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. I want to think a little bit tonight about influence. And I think, even though it doesn't say specifically here what I think is obvious, I think we know Naomi must have had a huge influence on Ruth. Naomi's example must have been one that would draw this daughter-in-law from another country to forsake her family and forsake her gods, to follow this mother-in-law back to another country. Y'all remember the name of the director of the movie The Ten Commandments? I've heard it pronounced Cecil, and I've heard it pronounced Cecil B. DeMille. He was talking one day in Hollywood about when he was a 9-year-old boy. There was a series of meetings at the church in town where he grew up. He said each day quite a few people would show up for the morning service, but one cold, rainy morning, he was the only one that showed up. The only one. He said he decided before it started, if this preacher preaches, he's the real deal. But if he just looks at one little boy and says, it's not worth preaching, I'm not going to put any stock in him. He said that preacher did preach that morning at the end of the service. He said something about a collection. He said, we didn't have our collection at the normal time, so I'm going to ask my audience to come up. And the audience, being the one little boy, came up and put his nickel where they put their collection. He said the preacher put his hand on his head and said a prayer. And he said, I have been bestowed many honors in Hollywood, but I was never honored more than that morning, because he was treated as if he mattered, just one little boy. That preacher had a great influence on him. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the next name, but it's Vincent Teresa. He wrote a book called My Life in the Mafia. He was a Boston mobster. He told stories about how his uncle would pay him $10 or $15 just to shine his shoes. He's a little boy, and back at that time, you know how $10 or $15 would excite a kid today for shining shoes, but this was back 80 or more years ago. He said, I don't know what he does, but I want to do whatever he does when I grow up. And he became a mob boss. Why? Because his uncle had a huge impact on him, an influence. Anybody read biographies? I know some of us do. Biographies are interesting, aren't they? You can watch them on the History Channel. You can watch them other channels, I guess, too, but you can read them. There's movies that are biographies or something based on a true life, most of those biographies include influences. And the story of Ruth includes influence. And when you think about it, what effect did the influence of Naomi on Ruth have? Who are some of the people that we know and associate with Ruth? Jesus. Yeah. Why is that, Tommy?
Well, Pastor, you or Luke could read the genealogy of Jesus, and you'll find this. You'll find Boaz.
You find Ruth and Boaz. Okay. Tommy, or anybody else? Who was the son of Ruth and Boaz? Who? Oh, he was a couple generations removed, wasn't he? Was it Obed? Obed. Who was the son of Obed? Jesse. Son of Jesse? David. All the way down to Jesus. In fact, you could look and say that influence even continues today. Now, the word influence has an interesting origin. It originally referred to an ethereal fluid thought to flow from the stars, which affected the actions of men. So what is ethereal? Well, I looked it up. And extremely delicate and light in a way that seems too perfect for this world. So the idea of influence came from this ethereal fluid thought to flow from the stars that affected the actions of men, something from the heavens, you might say. The only use of the word in the King James Version is in Job 38:31, where it says, God is questioning Job, can you bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, a group of stars? Okay. So the idea behind influence is that it's a power that produces an effect without any apparent force or direct authority. I'll give you an example. I'll give you two examples. If you tell your child to take the trash out and they take the trash out, that's not influence. It's good that they obeyed you, but that's not influence. If you rake the stuff off of your plate after your meal every night and rinse it and put it in the sink, and never tell your child to do that, but after a while they start doing that because they've seen it, that's influence. That's influence. Influence is unseen quite often, and it can affect many things. Someone once said there's nothing exaggerated more than the power of our words, and nothing exaggerated less than the power of our influence. Does that remind you of any sayings? I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. What happens when we aren't living what we espouse to believe? We're a hypocrite.
Or you're a bad influence.
Or a bad influence. Yeah. Okay. I want to look at three things about influence. The first one is influence is invisible. It's kind of like gravity. You don't see it, but it has its effect, right? Thank goodness. Otherwise, we'd just be floating around, I guess. And you could say we're going to meet at 7 o'clock, but I'm not sure how many of us would be able to make it without gravity. we often don't see that we're being watched and being an influence. There was a country song several years ago where the guy slammed on his brakes and said a word, and then he heard his 4-year-old say that same word. If anybody can remember the title of that, just let me know, because it slips my mind at the moment. But basically the little boy is saying, I want to be like you, Dad. And I'll be watching you. Thank you, Jamie. I'll be watching you. You never know who's watching you. You might, but you're never sure about who all is watching you. Influence is invisible. We need to be aware of the invisible flow of energy, if you will, from us to others that motivates them to take actions or develop attitudes. What are some possible attitudes they can learn from us? Being positive. Okay. Good habit that they'll learn. Being thankful. Mm-hmm. Dale, you taught school. Did you ever have any students that once you met the parents you thought, okay, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree?
Last year to teach high school, I was in the middle of it. I tried to go somewhere.
That's just been an observation. Jennifer, ever seen any of that? Kelly? I think probably most of us have, even if we hadn't been teachers. Apples don't fall far from trees, so kids that grow up in an environment where people are positive are more likely to be positive. What about negative? Complaining. Yeah. If you're in an environment where people complain, what are you likely to learn to do? Complain. Nitpick. What about encouraging? What about encouraging? Anybody ever have a coach and you remember they were very encouraging? I mean, they might have been tough, but they encouraged. What about critical? Parent, teacher, boss, critical. We need to be aware of our influence and think about how we influence others, just as Naomi influenced Ruth.
We learn, if you grow up with discipline, it's discipline with love, then you learn to discipline with love.
And the opposite of that's true too, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Quite often.
And respect, a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
Here we go back to teach it again.
Yeah. Well, I've talked to Tommy Carmichael several times where he's talked about families that basically the client is just following the family tradition. They grew up in an environment, and that's what influenced them to live as they live. So our influence is invisible. Second thing is our influence is inexhaustible. Naomi didn't just influence one person, did she? She influenced Ruth, but her influence didn't stop there, did it? Ruth, through marrying Boaz and through their family, influenced history and in fact actually influences everything now, right? through Jesus, her influence is still at work. Ruth is one of the top 10 names in America, or at least it has been, with over 1.5 million people bearing that name. So Ruth kind of gave that name a sense of dignity for history.
Something. How many ladies do you know whose name is Jezebel?
That's exactly.
It looked like you had a little mischievous grin on your face all that.
I remember a man teasing his daughter about the doll that she played with. Baby's name was Jezebel, and it was a joke. But in all seriousness, we don't read about. We don't hear about too many Jezebels, do we? The influence of that one woman was that we don't use that name. How does our influence continue? Through our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, the people around us. Third thing, influence is inevitable. We can't not be an influence. We can't not be an influence. Now, I know that's a double negative, right? And in English, somebody told me I shouldn't use double negatives. But we can't not be an influence. We are an influence, aren't we? I'll tell you what, if you agree, do this. Okay, just making sure we're all awake and listening. We can't do what? Yeah, exactly. Exactly. We can't not be an influence. We can be good or we can be bad as an influence. There's just no escape being an influence. So it really comes down to what we choose to do. Like I mentioned ago, those people who are a certain way because of their influences, the truth is we're all, to some extent, to a great extent, a product of influence, aren't we? We're very much a product of influence. We make choices, yes, but even the way that we see the choices and the way that we frame the alternatives has to do with influence, the way that we've been influenced in our lives. What you did when you first woke up this morning might have been because of influence. What you had for dinner might have been because of influence. The car you drive, or the truck you drive, or whether you drive a car or a truck. So many things in our lives are the product of influence. And just as we understand that, we need to understand that we're influencing others. A practical purpose of the book of Ruth is that we might be influenced by it, to see the impact of our influence on others, and be committed to make an impact for the glory of God. This is the point where I think Barry usually asks, are there any comments?
Well, my character or my influence, I started admiring for my son. He said, usually take out the trash, or like you said, don't say that to him, just so they can see you take out the trash, but, tell them to, or maybe on my bed, leave my door open so they see my bed and everything. So you try to let my character, my influence, like they'll kind of understand.
They see our character, and it is a huge influence, isn't it? We teach our children so much more by what we do than what we say.
I mean, their boys sing their prayer when we sit to eat. They sing it every night. Every time we sing it. Before anybody picks up the fork,
That's
their
awesome.
boys are singing.
That's awesome. Who else?
Sometimes we think we don't get through to them. And then maybe a month later, they'll say something or do something, and you'll be like, hey, you listening? I didn't think you were listening. But you're listening, wow. Or they'll say something like, well, I saw what you did, and I was like, okay. As long as it's good, that's fine. But don't let them see what you do, don't do bad, but, let them see you do good. They'll learn from it, whether you think they do or not.
Well, we don't know when they're watching, but we can almost expect they are at any point in time, can't we? What else? Well, then let's just move on a little bit to something off the cuff. If we have an influence, if we are influencing every day, how are we influencing people for Christ? How do we influence people for Christ? I know it's assumed that we must, because we pray sometimes that people will see our example and want to know more about what is causing the joy that we have in life. We pray that people will see our lives and want to come to know Christ. So, in what ways are we influencing?
Amazing. And I mean, y'all talked to me and anything like I've known you my entire life. That was amazing.
That was a great day.
It was a very good day. Because I mean, I didn't meet just one, I met the whole crew. And it was
So when
very, 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 very good day.
So when we reach out to help each other, we're influencing for Christ. What else?
Stephen, you might not realize it,
But from the first time you came here, you have been an influence. Just the way you are.
Well, my mother and father had a great influence on me, so if I've done anything, I would have to give them credit.
But I knew you before I knew them.
Anybody that's had much influence on you has been somebody that's been very consistent in doing it. And if it's the Christian life, I think the consistency of it is what influences people. Not just one Sunday, but every day of your life.
Being consistent. Yeah.
And well, I know people you notice I just notice a lot when you're out eating out. Not very many people say the blessing before they eat their food.
Mm-hmm.
I've actually had people get quiet
I don't know if everybody heard that, but Paul was talking about, for example, when we're eating out and we go ahead and say the blessing before we eat. That's a very simple way to be an influence, isn't it? If you're one of very few people who are doing that, it stands out. Thank you, Paul.
At times in your life you've been a bad influence, aren't we thankful that God has given us time and chance and ability to stop the bad influence, to turn it around for good? He wants us to go to heaven, but we have to make that change. If we're a bad influence, we have to make that change to be a good influence, so we can go to heaven.
That makes me think of something. How much of an influence is it when we're quick to forgive? When we're quick to forgive, it's godly. It is, because God is long-suffering, isn't He?
But you know, it's so hard to forgive our own self.
That can be, yes.
We can forgive others, but it's hard to forgive yourself. And it's so deep when we think about God and think about just the way He's so quick to forgive. And if we're like Him, we should forgive ourselves.
Mm-hmm. If God has removed our sin as far as east is from west, then we have no right to try to overrule Him and hang on to that guilt.
And just think about the Apostle Paul and Peter, the way they were.
You look at, what does Paul call himself? Chief among sinners?
You just think about how many bad things David did there at a certain time in David's life, and he was called, the man after God's own heart. Well, God extended, and he asked for, and God extended forgiveness. He had to go on after he made all those mistakes and do right for God. That's what we have to do sometimes. We have to stop those mistakes and do right for God, and like David did. You know.
And you
Repent.
know, in reading the
Change.
Psalms, David speaks of himself as like he never did anything wrong in a lot of them. And that's good. Now, I guess that's part of the reason he was a man after God's own heart, because he learned to forgive himself.
What makes it difficult to forgive others?
Human nature.
Human nature? Memories? Yeah. Sometimes, yeah, power.
You feel that if you forgive someone for doing something to you, that you give them power. When in actuality, you're taking your power back.
Yeah.
Because you're allowing God to be first and let Him be. He said, God in His word says that, let me do it. No, don't seek revenge. Let me intercede for you. So understanding that once you step back and you say, you know what, you did that to me, that hurt. Ouch. Take it as an ouch. It takes pressure off of you. So that way, it let God deal with the other person. Can't nobody else deal with you the way He can. But, He tells us to forgive. How many times is it?
70 times 7?
Yeah.
And
And that's, if you think about how many times that is, it's a lot.
Yeah.
It's every time. That's pretty much every single time a person does it to you. So a lot of times for me, when I did forgive, it was never about God, and it really wasn't even about that person. Being honest, it was about me. Because they did that, it's a victim, So when you choose not to be a victim of anymore, you choose God over everything else, God's actually giving you your power back. But you see it the opposite way when you don't forgive, make excuses for why you don't want to,
Yeah. It's an eye disease, isn't it? It's an eye disease. We're sick in a sense because we're focused on I, me, I.
I have to look at it like this. Sorry about that. Saul persecuted Christians, he killed them. And if God was able to turn around and forgive him for that, and make him one of his disciples, you know, the same thing happened to you. You know, he'll forgive you for what you did.
Yes. Hannah.
But sometimes we think we don't have to forgive because they didn't ask us for forgiveness. And that's not the way it works. We don't have to sit around waiting on them.
What did Jesus say? What was one of the sayings of Jesus on the cross? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. They hadn't one of them started asking for it, had they? But that was already his prayer. Should we not want to try to be the same way? How selfish is it? How selfish is it for us to not forgive somebody else, another human, a frail human being like ourselves, when God has forgiven us?
We don't forgive, God don't forgive us.
Yeah.
And the thing about God is that's removed from him. When you repent and he forgives you, you don't remember that anymore. We hang on to it, but we shouldn't.
Yeah.
We should let go just like God did to move on.
Yeah. I understand feelings. We all, if you don't have feelings, I'm scared of you. If you don't have feelings, please don't tell me, because I would be scared of you. We all have feelings, right? And sometimes when things happen, our feelings are hurt. And we may not be able to control them immediately. They may linger for a long time, but what can we control? Our actions and our thoughts, our choices. You know, I used to use as an example, when I was doing guidance counseling lessons on choices, driving down the road and somebody doesn't like the way that I pulled over. Maybe they thought it was too close in front of them, and so they passed by and they made a gesture with their hand and let me know that they thought I was number one. And, then they brake checked me, and, it just wasn't a good way to start the day. And the thing is, I, in that moment, can make a choice. I can either choose to move on, let that be their problem. They can own it. Or I can make it my problem and let it change my attitude and change my countenance and change the way that I look at the next part of my day and the next part of my day, right? We've all experienced similar things, and we sometimes have to just remember we make those choices. So getting back to forgiveness, we may have hurt feelings. They may last, but we have to choose to focus on forgiveness as best we can, to extend it, and let that be what determines our actions and not our feelings. And that will be a very influential thing in our lives if people see that. And if they ever ask, why did you forgive me? I would have held a grudge. You might have the opportunity there just to say, because God forgave me. Isn't that awesome?
You think about Paul as an example. God forgave him, and he killed people. He killed Christian people. And God forgave him and didn't remember that, but how hard would that have been for him to let go of
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it'd be something that would just, I don't know, it'd constantly be on my mind if I was in his shoes, but it just shows how God will forgive you and not remember those things.
I wonder if maybe Paul's past when he was Saul, especially persecuting the Christians, was part of his motivation to spread the gospel.
Oh, I'm sure it had an impact.
Thank y'all. I appreciate you all making comments and helping the class along. We'll have our devotional short.